In the quiet corridors of an exclusive preparatory school, two figures moved with careful grace, their faces etched with the weight of unimaginable responsibility. They weren't just any parents touring a potential school for their child. They were the Prince and Princess of Wales, carrying the burden of a cancer diagnosis that had shaken the very foundations of the British monarchy. While the world watched their every move, Catherine and William faced the most human of challenges, ensuring their eldest son's future while battling an illness that threatened to change everything. This is the untold story of how royal duty collided with parental love, how ancient traditions bent under the pressure of modern medical reality, and how two parents refused to let a devastating diagnosis derail their child's dreams. Behind the carefully orchestrated public appearances and measured royal statements lay a family fighting not just for survival, but for the chance to give their son the education that would prepare him to one day rule a nation. What the cameras couldn't capture and the headlines couldn't convey was the quiet determination in their voices as they asked the same questions any parent would ask, the way they held hands when they thought no one was looking, and the strength they found in focusing on their children's futures even as their own seemed uncertain. The Black Range Rover pulled through the gates of Ludgrove School just as the morning mist began to lift from the Berkshire countryside. Inside, Catherine, Princess of Wales, adjusted her navy blazer for the third time, her fingers trembling slightly despite her composed exterior. Beside her, Prince William stared out at the red brick buildings that had once been his own educational home, his jaw set with the familiar tension that had become his constant companion since Catherine's diagnosis. It was early March 2024, and the world had no idea that the future Queen of England was fighting the battle of her life. The official announcement wouldn't come for weeks, but already the palace machinery was working overtime to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Today's mission was deeply personal, yet impossibly public. Finding the right school for 10-year-old Prince George while navigating the most challenging period of their marriage and their roles as senior royals. The couple had been visiting schools in secret for months, each trip carefully orchestrated by their protection officers and private secretaries. They couldn't simply show up unannounced like other parents. Every visit required security sweeps, confidentiality agreements, and complex logistics that turned a simple school tour into a military-style operation. Catherine had insisted on continuing these visits despite her ongoing treatment. The chemotherapy sessions left her exhausted, but she refused to delegate this responsibility to anyone else. This was about George's future, about the careful balance between giving him as normal a childhood as possible while preparing him for the extraordinary destiny that awaited him. The headmaster of Ludgrove, who had taught William decades earlier, greeted them at the main entrance with the practiced discretion that came from years of dealing with high-profile families. He understood that today wasn't about royal protocol or photo opportunities. These were simply parents, albeit extraordinary ones, trying to make the best decision for their child. As they walked through the corridors lined with photographs of former pupils who had gone on to Eton, Harrow, and other prestigious institutions, Catherine's mind wandered to the conversation she and William had been having late into the night. How do you prepare your child for kingship while battling an illness that makes every decision feel urgent and weighted with possibility? The school had been William's sanctuary during his parents' tumultuous marriage and eventual divorce. He had found stability here among boys from similar backgrounds, away from the constant scrutiny of the press. Now, as he watched Catherine carefully examine the dormitories and ask thoughtful questions about the academic program, he wondered if George would need the same escape that this place had provided him. Catherine paused at a window overlooking the cricket pitch where William had played as a boy. Despite her illness, her maternal instincts remained sharp and focused. She asked about the school's approach to emotional support, about how they handled boys who might be dealing with family stress, about the balance between tradition and modern educational methods. The headmaster spoke carefully about the school's philosophy of building character through challenge, of creating young men who were confident but not entitled, prepared for leadership but grounded in service. These were the values that Catherine and William desperately wanted for George, especially knowing the burden he would one day carry. During the science laboratory tour, Catherine found herself gripping William's arm as a wave of nausea hit her. The medication was taking its toll, but she forced herself to focus on the demonstration the chemistry teacher was providing. She couldn't let her illness overshadow this important decision. George's education would shape not just his character, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. They spent nearly 3 hours at Ludgrove, far longer than the scheduled visit. Catherine wanted to see everything. The dining hall where George might share meals with future politicians and business leaders, the chapel where he would attend daily services, the dormitories where he would learn independence while still feeling safe and supported. As they prepared to leave, the headmaster walked them back to their car, sharing anecdotes about William's time as a student. Catherine listened with the intensity of a mother trying to imagine her son's future, while William found himself remembering the boy he had been, confused, sometimes angry, but ultimately shaped by the discipline and friendship he had found within these walls. The drive back to Adelaide Cottage was quiet. Both Catherine and William were lost in their thoughts about George's future and their own uncertain present. The weight of choosing the right school felt enormous when viewed through the lens of Catherine's diagnosis. What if this was one of the last major decisions she would help make for their children? That evening, as they tucked George into bed, Catherine found herself studying his face with new intensity. He was still their little boy, fascinated by helicopters and football, unaware of the gravity of both his mother's illness and his own future responsibilities. How do you prepare a child for both kingship and potential loss? William had suggested they might want to consider day schools, institutions that would allow George to come home each evening. But Catherine worried about the precedent this might set, about whether it would properly prepare him for the independence he would need as a future monarch. These weren't just educational decisions. They were choices about the kind of king George might become. The next morning brought another school visit, this time to Papelwick School in Ascot. The routine was becoming familiar. The security advance team, the discreet arrival, the careful balance between royal duty and parental concern. But each school offered different possibilities for George's development, and Catherine was determined to explore every option. At Papelwick, they met families who were facing their own difficult decisions. Other parents wrestling with the balance between ambition and happiness for their children, between tradition and innovation in education. For a few hours, Catherine could almost forget about the cancer, could lose herself in the universal concerns of parenthood. The school's emphasis on outdoor education appealed to both Catherine and William. They watched boys George's age learning to rock climb and navigate using traditional compass skills, activities that would give him confidence and practical abilities beyond the classroom. Catherine imagined George discovering new passions, developing the resilience that would serve him well in his future role. But the physical demands of these visits were becoming increasingly difficult for Catherine. The medication left her feeling constantly tired, and the stress of maintaining public composure while making such important decisions was exhausting. Still, she refused to scale back their school search. This was too important to rush or delegate. During lunch at Papelwick, sitting in the headmaster's study overlooking the playing fields, Catherine and William discussed their hopes and fears for George's education. They wanted him to understand duty and service, but they also wanted him to experience joy and friendship. They wanted him prepared for kingship, but not burdened by it too early. The headmaster spoke about the school's tradition of service, about how boys were encouraged to think beyond themselves and their immediate circle. This resonated deeply with Catherine, who had always believed that true leadership came from understanding and caring for others. Even as she fought her own battle, she was thinking about the kind of leader George might become. As spring turned to early summer, the school visits continued, but they became more focused. The list of possibilities was narrowing, and Catherine's strength was becoming more limited. Each visit now had to count, had to provide the clarity they needed to make this crucial decision. The press had begun to speculate about Catherine's absence from public engagements, creating additional pressure to maintain the facade of normalcy during these school visits. Every interaction had to be carefully managed to avoid raising questions that the family wasn't ready to answer publicly. The morning of their visit to Eton College dawned gray and drizzly, matching Catherine's mood as she sat in the back seat of the royal car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. This wasn't just another school visit. This was the institution that had educated Prince William, Prince Harry, and countless members of the British establishment. The weight of tradition seemed to press down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. William had been unusually quiet during the drive, lost in memories of his own time at the prestigious school. He remembered the pressure, the expectations, the way every achievement and failure was magnified by his royal status. Now, as they approached the familiar Tudor buildings, he wondered if he was doing the right thing by considering the same path for George. Catherine's treatment schedule had become more intensive, and the side effects were becoming harder to hide. She had lost weight, and despite the skilled work of the palace makeup artists, there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and physical exhaustion. Yet she had insisted on this visit, knowing that Eton represented not just an education, but a royal rite of passage. The headmaster met them at schoolyard, the ancient courtyard where generations of boys had gathered for daily announcements and ceremonies. Catherine looked up at the stone buildings, imagining a 12-year-old George walking these same paths, carrying the weight of his future crown, even as he tried to be just another schoolboy among his peers. During the tour of the boarding houses, Catherine asked penetrating questions about pastoral care and emotional support. Her own experience with cancer had made her acutely aware of how quickly life could change, how important it was for young people to have strong support systems when facing unexpected challenges. She wanted to know how the school handled boys who were struggling, who might be dealing with family crises or personal difficulties. The housemaster of Manor House, where William had lived during his time at Eton, spoke about the school's evolution since the 1990s. There was greater emphasis now on emotional intelligence and mental health, recognition that academic excellence meant little without psychological resilience. This evolution gave Catherine hope that George might have a more balanced experience than previous generations of royals. As they visited the science laboratories and technology centers, Catherine was struck by how the school balanced its ancient traditions with modern innovation. Boys in tailcoats worked on cutting-edge research projects, embodying the peculiar blend of old and new that defined modern British royalty. This seemed fitting for George, who would one day need to lead an institution steeped in tradition while addressing contemporary challenges. The afternoon brought a visit to the chapel, where Catherine and William sat quietly in a pew while the headmaster explained the school's approach to spiritual education. Catherine found herself praying silently, not just for her own recovery, but for wisdom in making decisions about George's future. The stained glass windows cast colored light across her face, and, for a moment, William saw not the Princess of Wales, but simply his wife, vulnerable and afraid, but determined to do right by their children. Their next stop was Harrow School, Eton's historic rival and another institution synonymous with British leadership. The Hilltop campus offered sweeping views of London, and Catherine couldn't help but think about how different George's perspective might be if he spent his formative years looking down on the city he would one day help govern. At Harrow, they met with current students who spoke passionately about their experiences. These boys seemed confident and articulate, but Catherine noticed something in their manner that concerned her. There was a certain entitlement, an assumption of privilege that she worried might ill-prepare George for the modern monarchy's emphasis on service and humility. The school's emphasis on leadership was appealing, but Catherine found herself questioning whether traditional notions of leadership were what George would need as a future king. The monarchy had survived by adapting to changing times, by remaining relevant to ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. She thought about her own cancer journey and how it had changed her perspective on what really mattered in life. During a private meeting with the headmaster, Catherine surprised everyone by asking about the school's approach to failure and setbacks. She wanted to know how boys were taught to cope with disappointment, how they learned resilience in the face of adversity. Her own experience had taught her that strength wasn't about never falling down, it was about learning to get back up. The conversation turned to the unique pressures facing royal children. The headmaster acknowledged that Harrow had experience with high-profile families, but admitted that the scrutiny facing George would be unprecedented. Social media and modern celebrity culture meant that every mistake, every awkward moment of adolescence, could become global news within minutes. William shared his own struggles with media attention during his school years, how the constant awareness of being watched had affected his ability to form genuine friendships. He wanted George to have authentic relationships, to understand that his worth wasn't tied to his future title, but to his character and actions. As they drove between schools, Catherine often closed her eyes and tried to imagine George navigating these environments. Would he find the confidence to be himself, or would he become another product of the system, polished but somehow diminished? The question felt urgent given her uncertain prognosis. Their visit to Winchester College offered a different perspective entirely. The school's emphasis on intellectual rigor and independent thinking appealed to Catherine's own educational background. She watched boys engaged in passionate debates about history and politics, seeing in them a curiosity and critical thinking that she hoped George would develop. The headmaster spoke about preparing students not just for university, but for life in an increasingly complex world. He emphasized the importance of global awareness, cultural sensitivity, and environmental responsibility, issues that Catherine knew would be central to George's future reign. During lunch in the medieval dining hall, sitting beneath portraits of former pupils who had shaped British and world history, Catherine felt the weight of choosing not just a school, but a future for George. Every institution they visited would mold him in different ways, creating different versions of the king he might become. The conversation with current Winchester students revealed young men who seemed more questioning, more willing to challenge assumptions than their counterparts at other schools. Catherine found this refreshing, but wondered if such intellectual independence might create conflicts with the constitutional role George would one day inherit. As they toured the science facilities, Catherine was struck by a project on cancer research being conducted by 16-year-old students. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here were teenagers exploring the disease she was fighting, approaching it with curiosity and hope rather than fear. It reminded her that education should inspire students to tackle the world's greatest challenges, not simply perpetuate existing systems. The evening brought difficult conversations at home. Catherine and William sat in their private sitting room, surrounded by brochures and notes from their school visits, trying to weigh the pros and cons of each institution. The decision felt impossibly complex, complicated by Catherine's illness and the unique pressures of George's position. They discussed their own educational experiences, William's struggles with being constantly watched, and compared to his father, Catherine's more conventional, but enriching experience at Marlborough College. Both wanted something different for George, but defining what that looked like proved challenging. The cancer treatment was affecting Catherine's ability to concentrate for long periods, making these detailed discussions exhausting. But she refused to step back from the decision-making process. This choice would shape George's character during the most formative years of his life, potentially determining what kind of king he would become. William suggested involving the king and Queen Camilla in the discussions, given their experience and perspective. But Catherine worried about too many voices influencing a decision that should ultimately be about what was best for George as an individual child, not as a future monarch. Late that night, after William had gone to bed, Catherine stood at George's bedroom door, watching their son sleep peacefully. In the soft light from the hallway, he looked so young, so innocent of the weight that would one day rest on his shoulders. She wondered if they were overthinking the school decision, if perhaps the most important education he could receive was simply growing up in a home filled with love and values. The pressure to get everything right felt overwhelming when viewed through the lens of her diagnosis. What if this was one of the most important decisions she would ever make for George? What if her judgment was compromised by the medication and the stress of treatment? These fears kept her awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and praying for clarity. The final school visit came in late May, when the English countryside was at its most beautiful and Catherine was reaching the midpoint of her treatment protocol. The destination was Lambrook School in Berkshire, a coeducational preparatory school that offered something none of the others could provide: the opportunity for George to be educated alongside his siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, when they reached school age. The decision to visit Lambrook had come after weeks of agonizing discussions and sleepless nights. Catherine had begun to question whether they were overthinking the entire process, whether their focus on prestige and tradition was overshadowing what might actually be best for George as a child who needed stability and family connection during an uncertain time. The headmaster and his wife greeted them at the main entrance of the Victorian manor house that served as the school's heart. Unlike the grand Gothic architecture of Eton or the medieval splendor of Winchester, Lambrook felt more like a large family home than an institution. Catherine felt something in her chest relax for the first time in weeks. As they toured the classrooms, Catherine was struck by the relaxed atmosphere and the genuine enthusiasm of both teachers and pupils. Children moved freely between indoor and outdoor learning spaces, and there was laughter echoing from the playground. This wasn't the rigid formality she had expected from her own preconceptions about preparing a future king. The school's emphasis on outdoor education immediately caught William's attention. He watched boys and girls George's age learning to build shelters, navigate using maps and compasses, and work together to solve practical problems. These were skills he wished he had learned at school, real-world competencies that would serve George well regardless of his future role. During a science lesson on environmental conservation, Catherine found herself genuinely engaged with the material for the first time in months. The children were discussing climate change with a sophistication that impressed her, but more importantly, they seemed to care deeply about the issues they were studying. This was the kind of engaged, compassionate leadership she hoped George would develop. The head teacher spoke about the school's philosophy of nurturing individual talents while building strong community bonds. They had experience with children from high-profile families, but emphasized that every child was valued for their own unique qualities rather than their background or connections. What struck Catherine most profoundly was watching the interaction between older and younger pupils. The school's house system created genuine mentorship relationships, with teenagers taking real responsibility for helping younger children navigate both academic and social challenges. She could imagine George thriving in this environment, developing empathy and leadership skills through service to others. During lunch in the dining hall, Catherine and William sat with current pupils who spoke enthusiastically about their experiences. These children seemed confident but not entitled, articulate but not performing. They talked about their teachers with genuine affection and described school traditions that were meaningful without being oppressive. The conversation turned to how the school handled media attention and privacy concerns. The headmaster explained their approach to protecting all pupils from unwanted scrutiny while still allowing them to engage with the wider world through community service and educational trips. This balance seemed essential for George's development. As they toured the sports facilities, Catherine found herself thinking about her own childhood and the simple joy of playing with friends without the weight of expectation. The children here seemed to embody that same natural happiness, and she began to wonder if perhaps this was what George needed most. Not preparation for kingship, but simply the chance to be a child. The music and drama departments revealed another dimension of the school's approach. Children were encouraged to explore creative expression not as future careers, but as essential aspects of human development. Catherine could imagine George discovering passions and talents that had nothing to do with his royal role, developing the rounded personality that would serve him well in any future. During a private meeting with the leadership team, Catherine surprised herself by sharing some of her concerns about George's future education. The cancer diagnosis had given her a new perspective on what truly mattered, and she found herself questioning many of the assumptions she and William had brought to their school search. The school's approach to pastoral care was comprehensive, but not overwhelming. They had systems in place to support children through family difficulties or personal challenges, but they emphasized building resilience and independence rather than wrapping pupils in protective isolation. This philosophy resonated with Catherine's own experience of facing adversity. As they prepared to leave Lambrook, Catherine felt a sense of peace that had been absent during their visits to more prestigious institutions. This school felt like a place where George could grow into himself rather than being molded into someone else's idea of what a future king should be. The drive home was different from previous school visits. Instead of tense silence or worried discussion, Catherine and William found themselves talking about positive possibilities. They shared stories from their own childhoods, remembering moments of genuine happiness and connection that had shaped their values more than any formal education. That evening, they made the unprecedented decision to include George in their discussions about his education. At 10 years old, he was old enough to have preferences and concerns about his future school. They sat in the family room with Charlotte and Louis playing nearby and asked George about his hopes and worries about secondary education. George's responses surprised them with their maturity and thoughtfulness. He wanted to continue learning about environmental science, hoped to play rugby, and expressed a desire to attend school with friends who would like him for himself rather than his title. Most importantly, he wanted to be somewhere that felt safe and welcoming. The conversation about schools became part of a larger discussion about the family's values and priorities. Catherine found herself articulating beliefs she had discovered through her cancer journey. That kindness mattered more than achievement, that genuine relationships were more valuable than social status, that resilience came from facing challenges with support rather than in isolation. William shared his own reflections on his education, acknowledging both the privileges and pressures he had experienced. He spoke honestly about his regrets and his hopes, about the kind of father he wanted to be and the kind of man he hoped George would become. Over the following weeks, as Catherine continued her treatment, the family returned to Lambrook for a second visit. This time, they brought Charlotte and Louis to see how they might fit into the school community when their time came. The prospect of all three children attending the same school felt like a gift, a chance for the siblings to support each other through the unique challenges of their position. The decision, when it came, felt natural rather than forced. Lambrook offered George the education Catherine and William had come to believe he needed: rigorous academics within a nurturing community, preparation for leadership through service to others, and the space to develop his own identity alongside his royal role. The announcement of George's school choice was made quietly, without the fanfare that might have accompanied a decision to attend Eton or Harrow. The family emphasized their desire for George to have as normal an educational experience as possible, while acknowledging the unique aspects of his position. Looking back on those months of school visits, Catherine would later reflect on how her cancer diagnosis had clarified her priorities as a mother. The uncertainty about her own future had made every decision about her children feel urgent and precious. But it had also freed her from some of the expectations and pressures that might otherwise have influenced their choices. The experience had taught her that the best preparation for George's future role might not be following the traditional path, but rather finding an environment where he could develop genuine empathy, real friendships, and the confidence to be authentically himself. These qualities would serve him well whether he was interacting with world leaders or simply try to understand the lives of the people he would one day serve. As George prepared for his transition to Lambrook, Catherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the decision they had made together as a family. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't followed the expected royal script, but it felt right. In a year that had been defined by uncertainty and fear, they'd found a way to make a decision rooted in hope and love. The school visits had been about more than education. They had been about defining what kind of future they wanted for their son and what kind of king they hoped he might become. In choosing Lambrook, they were choosing to prioritize character over prestige, community over isolation, and happiness over obligation. It was a decision that reflected not just their hopes for George, but their own evolution as parents and as people who had learned to value what truly mattered in life.